The Grand Palace stood as a testament to centuries of royal tradition, its towering gates adorned with intricate designs, its polished stone walkways reflecting the midday sun, and standing like immovable sentinels, the royal guards, stoic, disciplined, and unwavering, held their posts with a kind of stillness that seemed almost inhuman, their crimson uniforms and tall black bearskin hats adding to the spectacle that had drawn countless tourists to this very spot, eager to capture the perfect photo, to witness the unwavering discipline of those who served in the highest order of ceremonial protection. Yet among the sea of visitors that day, there was one man, an overly eager tourist with a camera strap slung across his chest and an obnoxious grin plastered on his face, who seemed far less interested in respecting the sacred traditions of this place and far more fixated on making a spectacle of himself. And those signs were posted everywhere, warnings etched in clear and unmistakable language. Do not touch the guards. Do not interfere. Respect the ceremony. He either failed to read them or simply didn't care, because as he approached the silent figure standing at attention, a mischievous glint flickered in his eyes, and ignoring the whispers of onlookers and the subtle, disapproving glances from those who understood the gravity of what he was about to do, he inched closer, his phone already lifted to capture the moment, grinning at the camera as he stood inches from the royal guard's shoulder. Then, with an exaggerated laugh, he raised his hand, waggling his fingers inches from the soldier's face, testing boundaries he clearly did not comprehend, and for a brief moment, the tension in the air thickened, an unspoken warning hanging between them. Yet the guard remained statuesque, unmoved, his eyes fixed forward as if he were nothing more than a living statue. But the tourist, emboldened by the apparent lack of response, pushed further his antics, growing more audacious as he turned to his friend, shouting loud enough for all to hear. "What's the big deal? They're just standing there like robots." And laughter rippled through the crowd, though not all found it amusing, some shaking their heads, others murmuring about how disrespectful the display had become. Yet no one intervened. No one stepped forward to stop what was rapidly escalating into something that could not be undone. And then, with a final act of blatant disregard, the tourist took a daring step forward, his fingers reaching out, and in an instant, in a moment that would be replayed in countless videos and news reports, he touched the guard, a mere brush of his fingertips against the soldier's rigid arm, an act so seemingly small yet so monumentally foolish, because in that instant, in that split-second violation of sacred protocol, the balance of order shattered, and for the first time, the royal guard moved, his grip tightening around his rifle, his jaw clenching beneath the weight of years of disciplined restraint, and the air itself seemed to still, as if the very atmosphere had sucked in a collective breath, because every single person in that crowd knew he had gone too far. And yet, before anyone could fully process the gravity of the situation, before the tourist himself could react, he took it one step further, one final, fatal miscalculation, tilting his head back and laughing as he threw an arm around the soldier's shoulder, pulling him into an unwanted pose for a selfie. And that was when it happened, the moment that would leave the crowd speechless, the moment that would be talked about for years to come, because the royal guard, bound by duty, by centuries of tradition, by the unshakable responsibility of protecting the sanctity of his post, finally acted. And what followed would shock every single person who had gathered there, waiting to see just how far the line could be pushed before it snapped. And as the camera flashed, freezing the moment in time, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold in the next breath. No one could have anticipated the reaction that would leave an entire crowd gasping. And yet it was too late. The damage had been done. The crack of movement was so sudden, so sharp, that for a moment, the crowd didn't fully register what had happened. The royal guard, once motionless as stone, had pivoted with the precision of a trained soldier, his gloved hand moving with blinding speed. And before the tourist could react, before his smug grin had a chance to fade, a resounding impact echoed through the open courtyard, the unmistakable sound of palm meeting flesh, ringing out in the stunned silence that followed. And in that instant, time seemed to freeze, the tourist staggering back, his sunglasses knocked clean off his face, his phone slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the cobblestones below. The very same fingers that had so carelessly disrespected centuries of tradition now trembling. His laughter instantly replaced with wide-eyed shock. His mouth opening but no words coming out, because what words could he say? What justification could he offer in the face of what had just occurred? And for a brief, breathless moment, no one moved. No one dared to break the silence, and then gasps, rippling through the crowd like waves, murmurs breaking into hushed exclamations. Did he just? Oh my God! Did anyone record that? And though dozens of phones had been lifted before in an attempt to capture the tourists' antics, now they were scrambling to hit record, to document the aftermath of an event so rare, so unprecedented, that it felt surreal, and yet it had happened. And as the tourist stumbled backward, hand clutching the side of his face where the force of the strike still burned against his skin, his expression twisted from shock into something else, something more, volatile, humiliation, anger, the dawning realization that he was now the spectacle, that he was the one being watched, dissected, judged, and yet, even as he opened his mouth to protest, even as his pride forced him to puff up his chest and take an aggressive step forward, the royal guard had already reset, his posture returning to its rigid, disciplined state, his gaze once more fixed forward, the moment of action erased as if it had never occurred, as if he had simply swatted away an insect and moved on, as if the entire encounter was beneath him, and that, more than anything, infuriated the tourist, the complete lack of acknowledgement, the utter dismissal, because in his mind he had been wronged, he had been assaulted, and suddenly his ego demanded justice, demanded validation, demanded that the world see him as a victim. So he whirled to face the nearest security officer, his voice rising in volume and pitch. Did you see that? He hit me. And yet, as soon as the words left his mouth, as soon as he sought to rally the crowd behind him, he made a devastating mistake. He looked at them. He searched their faces for outrage, for sympathy, for agreement, and what he found instead was something entirely different, because they weren't on his side. They weren't shaking their heads in horror at the guard's actions. They weren't demanding justice on his behalf. No, many of them looked, satisfied, some even smirking, and then, to his growing horror, it began a slow clap, one person at first, then another, until applause spread through the gathering like wildfire, accompanied by murmurs of approval, nods of respect, even a few cheers, and the tourist's stomach twisted, his indignation morphing into something far worse, embarrassment, deep, searing humiliation, because in that moment, he realized he wasn't the hero of the story. He wasn't the poor, mistreated visitor being unfairly targeted. He was the fool, the jester who had taunted the kingdom's warrior and paid the price, and as his face burned with shame, he clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way to reclaim control, to flip the narrative, to turn the crowd back in his favor. But before he could speak, before he could utter another word, a voice boomed across the courtyard, one that cut through the applause like a blade. Step back from the guard. Now. And the tourist froze, his heart hammering as he turned to see uniformed officers advancing, their expressions unreadable, their presence a reminder that he had trespassed far beyond the realm of harmless fun. And suddenly, the weight of his actions came crashing down on him. The reality that this wasn't a joke, that he had disrespected an institution far older and more powerful than himself. And though his instincts screamed at him to argue, to fight back, the tension in the air warned him. Otherwise, and so, with great reluctance, with clenched teeth and fists still trembling, he did the only thing left to do. He stepped back, head lowered, swallowing the bitter taste of defeat, and as the guards maintained their formation, as the crowd continued murmuring amongst themselves, the tourist knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was a moment he would never live down, a moment that had been captured, recorded, and would be replayed across the world. A lesson carved into history, and whether he liked it or not, he had just become famous for all the wrong reasons. As the murmurs in the crowd settled into an eerie quiet, the weight of the incident hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The tourist, now humiliated beyond measure, shifted uneasily under the gaze of hundreds of eyes, his bravado crumbling, his face still red from both the slap and the sheer embarrassment of being publicly put in his place. And though he wanted nothing more than to disappear, to erase the last 5 minutes of his life. Reality was relentless because the security officers, now flanking him on either side, weren't finished with him yet, their presence a silent but unmistakable message. There would be consequences, and as one of them, a tall, broad man with an air of quiet authority, stepped forward, the tourist instinctively took a step back, his earlier arrogance replaced with something dangerously close to panic. But there was no escape, no undoing what had already been set in motion. And then, in a voice as steady as the march of time itself, the officer spoke. "Sir, you have violated royal protocol and interfered with an official guard on duty," his tone leaving no room for argument, no room for negotiation. And though the tourist opened his mouth to protest, to grasp at whatever shreds of dignity he had left, the officer held up a hand, cutting him off with an efficiency that spoke of years of dealing with people like him. "You are now required to leave the premises immediately. Failure to comply will result in legal action." And that was when it truly sank in. That was when the reality of the situation finally crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was being expelled, forcibly removed from a site that welcomed thousands of visitors every day, and worse. He was being treated not as an innocent tourist, but as a disruptor, a man who had not only disrespected the traditions of a centuries-old institution, but had also been publicly reprimanded for it. And the humiliation was unbearable, suffocating. But what choice did he have? What option remained for him but to comply? So with slow, reluctant movements, he lowered his head, his ego shattered, his previous smirk now long gone. And as the officers gestured for him to move, he began his shameful walk of defeat, past the guards who remained unwavering, past the crowd whose eyes followed him like a silent jury, past the tourists who had once laughed with him but now barely concealed their amusement at his downfall. And just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, just when he thought he had suffered enough, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone clapping, slow, deliberate, mocking, and then another and another, until it grew into a wave of applause, a reverse ovation, a clear message that this was not his moment of triumph, but one of absolute disgrace, and his face burned. His pulse roared in his ears, but he forced himself to keep walking, forced himself not to react. Because the only thing worse than what had already happened would be to acknowledge it, to fight back and make an even bigger spectacle of himself. And so, step by step, he let himself be escorted through the gates, past the historic walls, until he was out, expelled, permanently etched into the collective memory of every person who had witnessed his downfall. And as he stood there, just outside the palace grounds, breathing heavily, his hands shaking with residual anger and humiliation, he heard the distant echoes of conversation, of laughter, of headlines being born, because of course this wouldn't end here. Of course this wouldn't be forgotten. There were videos, there were recordings, there were social media posts already being shared at lightning speed, and he could see it now. The headlines he would soon be forced to face. Tourist slapped by royal guard after disrespecting protocol. Watch. Foolish tourist tries to prank royal guard. Instantly regrets it. And the worst of them all, the one that would haunt him forever. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. A masterclass in disrespect, and he wanted to scream, wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to twist the story in his favor. But how could he? How could he when the evidence was right there for the world to see, when he had become the embodiment of what not to do? And as he finally gathered the courage to pull out his phone, to check the damage, to see just how far this had spread, the first thing he saw was his own face. Frozen mid-slap, eyes wide with shock, mouth agape in disbelief. Already plastered across multiple platforms, already accumulating thousands of shares, comments, and memes, and at that moment, he knew there was no escape, no salvaging his reputation, no way to undo the disaster he had brought upon himself. And as he turned away from the palace, shoulders hunched, steps heavy with the weight of his own foolishness, he realized something painful, something undeniable. He had traveled across the world, spent thousands on this trip, all for the experience of a lifetime, and now he had it, a memory that would follow him forever, not as a tale of adventure or cultural appreciation, but as a cautionary story, a legend of disgrace, a viral sensation. And though he had come as a tourist, He would leave as something else entirely, a warning to all who dared to forget that some traditions are not meant to be mocked.